The man stood at his window every morning with a cup of coffee in his hand, and every morning his eyes drifted to the oak tree that towered proudly in his front yard, its wide branches stretching out like the arms of an old guardian, its thick trunk marked with grooves and scars that carried the history of decades. This tree was not just wood and leaves, it was a part of his family. Planted by his grandfather with his own hands long before the HOA even existed, he had grown up under its shade. Climbing the branches as a boy, carving his initials into the bark as a teenager, and sitting quietly beneath it as an adult whenever life grew heavy, the neighbors admired it too. Children from the block gathered under its shadow to play hide and seek. Swings had been tied to its branches in summers, and families sometimes paused while walking past to simply look at it. Some even said the whole street looked more beautiful because of that tree. It was more than just a landmark of his home. It was a landmark of the community itself, but to him it was even more personal, a living reminder of his grandfather's voice telling him that the strongest things in life take the longest to grow, that patience and care made roots that no storm could tear out, and every time he touched the rough bark he felt those words alive again. The man never imagined that anyone could see it as anything but a treasure, but then the HOA arrived with their letters. One plain white envelope carrying words that felt like poison. They claimed the tree was unsafe, that its roots might damage sidewalks, that its height was a hazard, that storms might tear its branches down. They spoke of liability, of uniform looks, of community safety. But between the lines he saw something colder, a will to strip away what made his home different, what made it his. At first he ignored the letter, crumpling it and tossing it aside. Surely no one would dare touch something that had stood for generations. But more letters came, each one sharper, each one colder. Warnings turned into demands, fines threatened, meetings called, and every time he refused to attend, choosing instead to sit under the oak and breathe the cool air that drifted through its leaves. His friends told him to fight back. Some neighbors even said the HOA had been eyeing his land for changes, whispering that the tree blocked the view of newer homes, that some board members thought it made the street look uneven. Uniformity, they said, was their excuse for control. His chest grew tight every time he thought of it. Why would they target this tree when so many others stood in the neighborhood? Why this one? Why his? He began noticing the way the president of the HOA slowed her car when she passed, her eyes lingering on the oak with a look not of fear but of irritation, as if beauty itself offended her, as if his grandfather's gift to the land was a thorn in her plans. He walked the yard that evening, his hand pressed to the trunk, the grooves rough under his palm, and he whispered to himself that he would never let them take it, no matter the cost. But even as he said the words he felt a chill deep in his gut, because he had seen the way the HOA worked. They were relentless. They buried people in papers, in threats, in court cases. They wore people down until they gave up, and the thought of them standing against his tree filled him with a dread he had not felt since he was a boy. Yet when the wind moved through the branches and the sound of leaves filled the air, he felt stronger again, as if the tree itself reminded him that storms had come before and still it stood. Still it reached upward to the sky, and so would he the next week. Another envelope arrived, heavier than the first, its words sharper. The HOA now claimed that if he did not remove the oak tree within 30 days he would face heavy fines for every day it remained standing. The man read the letter slowly, his hands shaking with anger. The words called his tree a danger to the neighborhood, a liability that could cause accidents. They said its roots might break pipes underground, that its branches could fall on cars. But he knew the truth. The tree had stood through storms fiercer than any car or pipe. It had survived hurricanes, lightning strikes, and even droughts. It had been the only shade for children when summers burned hot. Yet now it was painted as a threat. He crumpled the letter and threw it into the fire, telling himself they could not scare him. But within days another envelope came. This one carried a fine, a notice that he owed money simply for refusing their demand. His chest grew tight as he stared at the paper, anger burning hotter than fear. Because this was not about safety. This was about power. The HOA president had been seen talking to a group of wealthy homeowners on the street, her finger pointing toward his yard, her lips moving quickly, their heads nodding in agreement. And though he could not hear the words, he could feel the weight of them, a decision already made without him. Neighbors who once smiled at him now crossed the street in silence. Some even whispered that maybe it was time for the old oak to go. But he noticed others glancing at the tree with sadness, their children still playing under its branches, their eyes saying what their mouths could not, that the HOA was wrong. He sat beneath the oak that evening as the sun bled into the horizon, his hand pressed against the trunk, and he felt the strength of roots deep under the soil, roots his grandfather had planted with care, roots that could not be seen but held more power than any board or president. Yet still the fear crept in, because he had seen what the HOA did to people who resisted. He remembered the man across the street who once refused to repaint his house the approved color. The HOA had buried him in fines until he gave in. Another neighbor had been threatened with court for keeping chickens in his yard. They had been forced to sell. Every story was the same. Resistance met with pressure. Pressure until the spirit broke. But he was not like them. He told himself he would not bend. Still the next morning another letter came. This one written in bold print. A final warning. The HOA demanded entry onto his property to inspect the tree. They claimed legal right, though he knew in his heart it was trespassing. His hands trembled as he read it, his anger mixing with dread. What if they came while he was away? What if they brought their workers? What if one night he woke up and the sound of chainsaws filled the air? The thought made his stomach twist, and yet he also felt something else, a fire deep inside that told him he would fight, that they might bring their papers, their threats, their fines. But he had something stronger. He had history, he had truth, and he had a tree whose roots were deeper than their greed. Still the suspense grew with each day. Every knock on the door, every car slowing by his yard, every rustle of wind in the branches made him turn, expecting to see them standing there with their saws. And as he lay awake at night staring out at the dark outline of the oak against the moonlit sky, he whispered to himself again and again, "They will not take it. They cannot take it." But the fear and the waiting ate at him, because he knew the HOA was not done. They were just beginning. That night he could not sleep. The silence outside was heavy, too heavy, as if the air itself was holding its breath. He sat by the window staring at the dark outline of the oak tree standing tall under the pale glow of the moon, its branches swaying gently in the night wind. It looked so calm, so eternal. And yet his chest tightened with dread, because the HOA's letters had been clear, their threats growing louder, and he feared that sooner or later they would stop writing and start acting. His fears came true when just after midnight the sound of engines broke the quiet. He leaned forward, heart pounding, and saw headlights creeping slowly down the street, stopping near his yard. Then came the sound he dreaded most, the harsh roar of chainsaws tearing into the night. His blood turned cold as he leapt from his chair, grabbing his boots and rushing out the door. The noise grew louder, the biting grind of steel against wood. And when he reached the yard his eyes widened in horror. 3 men in reflective vests stood at the base of the oak, saws screaming as they cut deep into the trunk, chunks of bark and splinters flying into the air. The tree that had stood for decades now trembling under their blades. He shouted with all his strength, his voice cracking the night like thunder. The men froze for a moment, but the HOA president's car sat nearby, her figure visible inside, her hand gesturing for them to continue. Rage surged through him as he charged forward, grabbing at the nearest saw. The worker stumbled back, shouting that they had orders, but he did not care. His hands shook as he pulled at the machine. The smell of oil and burning were choking his lungs. The president stepped out of her car, her face lit by the red taillights, and she smiled coldly as if this destruction was her victory. The men started again, their saws biting deeper, sparks flying as the blades chewed through old strong wood. And then with a sickening crack one of the thick branches split apart, crashing down into the yard, the sound echoing like a gunshot. His chest ached as if the blow had landed on him instead of the tree. He screamed that this was his property, that they had no right. But the president only crossed her arms and said the board had declared the tree unsafe, that they were doing the neighborhood a favor. His voice broke as he shouted that it was his grandfather's tree, a piece of history, a piece of his family. But his pleas meant nothing. The saws roared louder, another branch fell. Sawdust filled the air like smoke. Neighbors opened their windows, their faces pale in the moonlight, children peeking from behind curtains as the mighty oak was torn apart. Some whispered but none dared to come closer. Fear of the HOA's power freezing them in place. The man stood, helpless, his fists clenched, his heart breaking with every strike of steel against wood, until at last the saws quieted, their work half done. The tree still standing but its proud figure broken, its crown cut down, its branches scattered on the ground like fallen soldiers. The workers packed their tools and drove off. The president paused only long enough to give him one last look, her smile sharp with cruelty. Then she slid into her car and vanished into the night, leaving him alone with the ruins. He sank to his knees, his hands pressed to the scarred trunk, tears burning his eyes. The oak that had survived storms, lightning, and time itself had been crippled not by nature but by greed. And as the night wind moved through the shattered branches, the sound was not the song of leaves but the whisper of loss. Yet beneath his grief another feeling stirred, a seed of defiance, because though they had cut it, though they had tried to break him, the tree still stood, scarred but alive. And so did he, and in that moment he swore that this fight was far from over. The morning sun rose over the street and revealed the broken shape of the oak tree. Its once proud branches now scattered across the lawn like bones. The neighbors gathered slowly at their fences and sidewalks, whispering to each other as they looked at the wreck. Children who once played under its wide shade now clutched their parents' hands, eyes wide with confusion. The man stood in his yard with his arms crossed. His face hard but his eyes burning with grief. Every piece of sawdust felt like an insult. Every fallen limb a wound. And just when he thought it could not sting more, the HOA president arrived. Stepping out of her car with a satisfied smirk, she raised her voice loud enough for everyone to hear, saying the board had done the right thing, that the tree had been an ugly hazard, and that now the street looked tidier. She even had the nerve to clap her hands lightly as if it was some kind of victory. The man's jaw tightened but he said nothing, because he knew every word from her lips was meant to humiliate him, meant to paint him as stubborn, reckless, and defeated. Some of the board members joined her, nodding along, their eyes sweeping over the crowd to make sure no one dared speak against them. But he noticed something else in those gathered faces. The neighbors were not smiling. Their whispers carried doubt. Some looked angry, others looked ashamed, and a few looked at him with sympathy. The president continued her speech, saying the community owed thanks to the board for taking action where others were too afraid, her voice dripping with false pride. And then she turned to him with mocking sweetness, telling him he should be grateful they had handled what he could not. The words hit him like a blade, humiliation burning deep in his chest. But he still did not shout. He stood tall and silent, letting the moment stretch, because sometimes silence carries more weight than any word. The neighbors shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between the proud president and the quiet man standing beside the ruined tree. And in that uneasy silence the cracks began to show. A child tugged at his mother's arm asking why they hurt the pretty tree. An old neighbor shook his head and muttered that the oak had stood longer than any of them had lived. Whispers grew, some saying it looked worse now, that the board had gone too far. The president's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she quickly turned away, ordering her members back into their cars. They left with their heads held high as if they had won. But the man could see the unease in their steps. He remained by the trunk long after they had gone, his hand pressed to the scarred wood, his humiliation cutting deep. Yet in that very wound a strange spark of defiance began to burn brighter. They thought they had destroyed him by destroying the tree. They thought the sight of his shame would keep him down, but he could feel in the shifting air, in the murmurs of the crowd, that something had changed, and that this broken oak, instead of ending his fight, might just become the beginning of theirs. The afternoon sun fell across the broken oak, its half-cut trunk standing like a wounded giant in the middle of the yard. The man sat on his porch staring at it, the ache in his chest heavy but mixed with a fire that would not go out. Neighbors still slowed their steps when passing, some shaking their heads, some whispering that it looked like a crime, and others too afraid to say anything at all. Then something unexpected happened. A young photographer driving through the neighborhood stopped his car and got out, his camera hanging around his neck. He stood still for a moment looking at the ruined tree, his eyes narrowing not with pity but with fascination. He lifted his camera and began clicking, the shutter echoing like small cracks of thunder in the quiet street. The man frowned, walking closer, asking what he was doing. The photographer smiled slightly and said the tree was haunting, broken but still beautiful. He said it looked like a piece of art carved by tragedy, something people needed to see. Before the man could answer, another neighbor walked up and asked if she could take a picture too, pulling out her phone. Soon more people gathered, curious, pointing, snapping photos, posting them online, their voices carrying words like powerful, strange, haunting. One woman said it looked like a monument to survival. Another said it looked like nature's protest against control. The man stood silently, his heart still heavy with anger yet now filled with confusion as he watched strangers treat his pain like a masterpiece. By evening the first photos had already spread across local groups online, captions calling it the broken oak, comments pouring in, some people demanding to know why it was cut, others saying they wanted to come see it themselves. The man sat back on his porch that night staring at the glow of his phone as the images spread further than he imagined. His tree, once just a piece of family history, had become something else, something bigger. And though the scars in its trunk cut deep, it seemed those scars were now telling a story louder than any words he could have spoken. The HOA had tried to humiliate him by destroying what he loved. But with the click of a single camera, a new story had begun, one that even they could not control. By the next morning, the man noticed something strange outside his window. Cars he had never seen before were slowing down near his yard. Some stopped completely, people leaning out with phones in their hands pointing at the half-destroyed oak. He stepped outside and saw two teenagers standing near the sidewalk snapping selfies with the trunk in the background. Their voices excited as they laughed and said this looked even better in real life than in the pictures online. The man frowned, confused, wondering how quickly the image of his broken tree had traveled. But before he could ask, another car stopped, then another, and soon a small line of vehicles began to form, people stepping out, some carrying cameras, others simply holding their phones high, clicking non-stop. He heard them whispering words like haunting, inspiring, powerful. One man said it looked like a war monument. Another said it was a natural sculpture. The man stood silently with his arms folded, trying to understand what was happening. His humiliation was being turned into attention, and the very tree that had been cut to disgrace him was now pulling strangers from all over the county. By noon the street was filled with cars parked along both sides, families walking up with their children, groups of college students posing beside the jagged trunk. Even an older couple who said they had driven an hour just to see what everyone online was talking about. Some asked if they could step closer into the yard to touch the bark, others stayed back but lifted their cameras as if they were in front of a museum piece. The sound of shutters and laughter mixed with the rustling of the broken leaves still clinging to the branches. And for the first time in days the man felt something shift deep inside him. The sorrow still pressed heavy on his chest, but he began to sense that the tree was not dead. It was alive in a new way. Alive in the eyes of these strangers who saw beauty where the HOA had seen nuisance. Still not everyone came with kindness. A few neighbors muttered angrily that the crowd was blocking the street, that this attention was embarrassing the community, and he noticed the HOA president's car crawling slowly past. Her face twisted with disbelief as she saw the crowd surrounding the very thing she thought had humiliated him. Her lips pressed thin, her hands tight on the wheel as she sped away. The man almost smiled for the first time, because he could see how much this scene would sting her. She had tried to cut his pride down, but instead she had made him stronger. And every person with a camera was proof. As the day stretched on, the numbers grew larger. Food trucks even appeared nearby, sensing the chance to profit from the curious visitors. A group of local artists set up easels across the street sketching the twisted shape of the oak, their brushes moving quickly, capturing the story in strokes of paint. The man watched them all from his porch, silent and steady, and though his heart still ached for the branches that were gone, he realized that the tree had become something greater than it had ever been before. It was no longer just his family's memory. It was now the town's story, a symbol of resilience standing tall even when broken. And the more people arrived, the more he knew the HOA's plan had backfired completely. Because the tree they had destroyed to break him had now become the very thing that made him untouchable. Within a few days, the quiet street that once only echoed with children's laughter and the sound of leaves rustling in the wind was transformed into something no one had ever seen before. Vans with satellite dishes on top began rolling in. Reporters stepped out with cameras slung over their shoulders. Local news anchors in sharp suits and dresses stood in front of the half-destroyed oak tree speaking into microphones while their crews filmed every angle of the jagged trunk. The man stood on his porch watching with disbelief as lights and tripods filled his front yard. One reporter approached him politely asking if he was the homeowner. When he nodded, she immediately began firing questions. How did he feel when the HOA cut down his tree? What did the tree mean to him? Did he think it was fair? And though his voice shook at first, he answered with steady words. He told them about his grandfather planting the oak, about children playing under it, about the letters and the threats, and about the night he watched helplessly as chainsaws tore through what had stood for generations. His story poured out and the cameras captured every word. By that evening his face and his tree were on television across the county. Headlines flashing on screens saying things like HOA cuts down historic oak. Backlash erupts and broken tree becomes town symbol of resistance. Social media lit up with photos and videos, some showing the board president's car near the scene, others showing the massive crowds lining up to take selfies. The more the story spread, the more people arrived. Traffic backed up for blocks. Local shops reported business booming. As tourists came not just for the tree but to eat, to drink, to talk about it, the broken oak had become a landmark overnight. Yet the HOA could not stop it. Their attempts to paint him as reckless had collapsed in front of the cameras. Because now the world could see the truth. The world could see what they had done, and reporters were not kind to them. One even chased the president down the street asking why the HOA cut a tree that belonged to a private homeowner. She refused to answer. Slamming her car door and speeding off, the video of that moment went viral with people mocking her silence. Memes spreading faster than she could control. Neighbors who had once feared speaking out now openly admitted to reporters that they had loved the tree, that the HOA had been wrong, and that the man was right to stand his ground. Every news segment, every online post, every shared photograph turned the HOA's humiliation deeper. What they had meant to be his shame had become their public downfall, and through it all the man sat quietly beneath the broken oak, watching strangers pat its trunk, watching children pose happily beside its scarred wood, hearing voices from across the county call it beautiful, haunting, and strong. He felt a strange calm in those moments, because he knew the fight was no longer his alone. It had become something bigger. It had become a storm too strong for the HOA to contain. And the more they tried to silence it, the louder it grew. The media had taken his pain and carried it beyond the borders of his street, beyond the control of the board, and now the whole town, maybe even the whole state, knew his story. The HOA president thought she could ride out the storm. She told her board members that the excitement would fade, that people would forget. But each day the crowds grew larger, each day new reporters arrived, and each day the story spread further. Soon radio stations were talking about it. Bloggers were writing articles about the broken oak, and even a well-known magazine sent a photographer to capture the strange beauty of the half-cut tree. The HOA held an emergency meeting in the community hall. Their voices tense and angry. The president slammed her papers down and said the tree was an eyesore, that it made the neighborhood look weak, that the man was embarrassing them. But the other members shifted uneasily in their chairs, some whispering that they had never seen this much attention before, some saying the HOA had gone too far. Cracks began to form among them, their unity breaking under the weight of the media storm. Yet the president refused to back down. She sent out new letters demanding the man remove the remains of the tree entirely, claiming the crowd was a disturbance to community peace. But by then it was no longer in her hands. The county officials had stepped in. A team of inspectors came, walking around the yard, studying the trunk, measuring its rings, and after hours of discussion they announced that the oak was now being considered for landmark protection. They said it had cultural value, historic importance, and above all it had become a symbol for the people. The man could hardly believe their words as they shook his hand, telling him the tree could not be touched without approval from the county. The HOA president's face turned pale, her lips tight as she tried to argue, but the officials ignored her protests. Neighbors who had once stayed quiet began clapping, some even cheering. The story had flipped completely. What had been meant as humiliation was now being celebrated. The HOA president tried one last desperate move. She called a press conference outside her office. Cameras gathered as she stood stiffly behind a podium. She spoke about community safety, about order, about how rules existed for a reason. But the reporters were not convinced, their questions sharp and relentless, asking why she ordered the tree cut in the first place, asking why the HOA trespassed onto private land, asking if she regretted her decision. Sweat formed on her forehead as she stumbled over her answers, her voice cracking as the crowd shouted back. And when one reporter asked if she would apologize to the homeowner, she froze. The silence stretched, her eyes flashing with anger, and instead of apologizing she turned and walked away. The cameras caught every second. The video spread instantly, people mocking her cowardice, her reputation collapsing. In that moment, the HOA's power shattered. Board members began resigning one by one. Neighbors whispered that they wanted nothing more to do with her, and she was left standing alone in her office, her pride in ruins. The man watched all of this unfold from his porch, sitting quietly under the shadow of the broken oak. He did not need to speak because the tree spoke for him, its scarred trunk standing as a monument to their failure, and every car that slowed down, every family that stopped to take a picture, every laugh of children posing beside it deepened the HOA's embarrassment. The very thing they tried to erase had become the one thing they could never escape. The weeks that followed turned the quiet street into something no one could have imagined. The broken oak that once stood only as a private memory for one man was now on postcards, t-shirts, and posters. Artists painted it, photographers sold prints of it, and influencers posted videos in front of it calling it the most unique landmark in the county. The man sat on his porch every evening watching cars slow down to take pictures, buses bringing tourists who lined up along the sidewalk, even school trips arriving where teachers told children the story of how one tree became a lesson in standing strong. The HOA that once carried themselves like rulers now hid in silence, their meetings empty, their authority broken. The president herself no longer drove proudly through the neighborhood but slipped out quietly, her head low. Because everywhere she went whispers followed, whispers of the tree she tried to destroy and the fame it brought instead. The man never shouted, never gloated, he simply stood steady as the world shifted around him. But deep inside he carried a quiet satisfaction, because he knew that every camera flash was another reminder to the HOA of their failure. One day a real estate agent knocked on his door, offering him a shocking price for his home. Saying the property value had tripled because of the landmark in his yard. People wanted to buy not the house but the story. He smiled faintly and shook his head, telling them it was not for sale, because the land belonged to his family and no amount of money could replace the roots buried deep beneath it. The agent left disappointed, but he felt stronger for saying no. The county later placed a bronze plaque near the tree declaring it protected as a cultural landmark, reading "The Broken Oak, a symbol of resilience." When he read those words carved in metal, his chest swelled, because this was no longer just his fight. It was a victory carved into history itself. Neighbors who once doubted him now came to shake his hand. Some apologized for staying silent. Some brought their children to thank him for not giving up. And though he only nodded politely, inside he felt the warmth of knowing his grandfather would be proud. The HOA president could not bear it any longer. She resigned. Officially, her statement full of excuses, claiming she was misunderstood. But no one believed her, and her name was soon forgotten while the Broken Oak's fame only grew. That night the man sat beneath the half-cut tree, the moonlight shining across its jagged trunk, and he thought about the long fight, about the nights of fear and anger, about the moment he thought he had lost everything. And he realized that in trying to humiliate him they had given him a gift far greater than he could have imagined. They had turned his pain into a story that would outlive them all. He closed his eyes and listened to the soft sound of the leaves still clinging to the branches, moving in the night wind, and for the first time he laughed, not a loud laugh but a quiet one. The kind that comes when justice is complete. The HOA had tried to destroy him. They had tried to erase his pride, but in the end it was their pride that had been erased. And he was left with the last laugh, a laugh carried by the wind, a laugh that would echo through every picture, every story, and every memory tied to the broken oak that stood tall even when broken months passed and still the broken oak stood firm. Its jagged trunk a scar yet also a crown. Tourists still came though the rush had calmed into a steady stream. Artists still painted its strange beauty. Couples posed for wedding photos beside it. And children still played in its shadow just as they had before. But now the tree was more than a playground. It was a story, a lesson, a monument of resistance. The man's yard was no longer just a yard. It had become a destination. Buses stopped at the corner with guides pointing out the oak and telling visitors how one man refused to bow to the will of the HOA. Every time he heard those words he felt pride mixing with disbelief. Because he had never planned to become a symbol, he had only wanted to protect his grandfather's tree. Yet fate had turned his pain into something larger than himself. The HOA had completely collapsed by then, members quitting one after another, their meetings cancelled, their funds drained by lawsuits and fines. The president had vanished from the neighborhood entirely, her house sold, her name remembered only as a warning of arrogance, and in her absence the community began to change. Neighbors once afraid to speak now stood tall. They planted flowers, painted fences, decorated their yards with pride. Free from the constant fear of uniformity, they said the tree had given them courage, that if one man could stand against the board then so could they. The man listened quietly, nodding, his heart heavy with gratitude but also with the weight of memory, because he still remembered that night when the saws cut through the wood, when he thought everything had been lost. Sometimes in the quiet hours he would touch the scarred bark and close his eyes, hearing again the sound of chainsaws. But now instead of breaking him the memory gave him strength. It reminded him that he had endured, and that endurance had given birth to something that even time could not erase. The county eventually held a ceremony. Officials gathered in front of the oak with microphones, a crowd of hundreds filling the street, and they declared the tree a permanent historic landmark protected by law. The man stood before them, his voice steady as he spoke. He told the crowd that the oak was never just a tree. It was a reminder that what is rooted deep cannot be torn out, and that, no matter how hard anyone tries, truth and history always rise again. The applause that followed shook him to his core, not because he wanted fame but because he realized his grandfather's gift had not been lost, it had been reborn. When the crowd left that evening and the lights dimmed, he sat beneath the oak once more, the cool night air wrapping around him, the scarred trunk glowing silver in the moonlight. He thought of the HOA, of their smug smiles, of their threats, of their destruction. And he thought of how it all ended, with their power gone, their pride shattered, their names forgotten, and his oak standing taller in story than it had ever stood in life. He let out a slow breath, leaning against the bark, whispering softly that they had tried to humiliate him. But in the end they had only written his victory. The last laugh belonged not just to him but to the tree itself, a laugh that echoed in the footsteps of tourists, in the clicks of cameras, in the whispers of children, pointing at its twisted beauty. And as the night grew quiet again he closed his eyes, knowing that long after he was gone the broken oak would remain, a silent giant carved by cruelty yet crowned by resilience, proof that sometimes the things others try hardest to destroy become the things that live forever.